1400 years ere seed sown. Truth was twisted, its seeds were grown. Break the lies, spark the mission. Welcome to Quranic Inquisition.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the show. Peace of the Lord to all of you. Shalom, assalamu alaikum, namaste. And welcome. We are going to be discussing something a little bit different today. Normally, we talk just about Quranic verses, but through this journey, we have to also delve into the historical context that was happening in 7th century Arabia and so on. So Kash and I we would make notes of things of importance, and a few of them they seem to be relevant to this little feud that is happening at the moment, and we will start talking in a minute. But before, hello Kash, how are you doing today, mate?
I'm doing good, JC. How are you?
I am good. So, do you want to reveal on whose side you are on?
Wait, doesn't that... Okay, fine. I'm on Jay Smith's side. Ruin it from the beginning. All right, yeah. How about you?
Okay, we will see. We will see. But
Okay.
people who have actually been watching our channel, they know that our work is primarily around the Quran and the meanings of the Quran. So, therefore, finding what the origins of the Quran are, not Islam as a whole, although, of course, it is related to all of that, but particularly the Quran and finding words that are hidden in there, like we've discussed about crucifixion being hidden in the book and baptism and so many other things that we're working on. So, that seems to be a thesis that, or finds that much better J. Smith's approach when he says, well, this book was not even an Arabic book, and it came from different sources. And this is certainly what we are going to, what we are finding. And today we're going to have a look at other things. We're going to see if the other stuff that we find in the history, in the historical accounts, they actually match better Raymond Ibrahim's thesis or view of this problem or J. Smith's. So, should we make a start, Kash?
Yes, I'm more than happy to.
Okay, well, let's begin. First of all, I have actually used a couple of slides from Jay Smith, which I hope he will actually not mind. But this is the gentleman on the screen, and anyone who has seen any of his videos and his thesis, the book, The Man and the Place, they will be familiar with these slides. I have just plagiarized very little of this. We're going to just move on, but people would be familiar with the look of these slides when he actually shows the standard Islamic narrative, what it says about the book, about Muhammad, about the caliphs, and so on. Another one that he uses quite a bit, of course, is this as to how the standard narrative is meant to have been written down according to their traditions when Al Bukhari lived and when those hadiths were written, and so on. So people should be probably quite familiar with that by this point. People who are familiar with this channel, they will be familiar with Jay Smith. If you haven't, make sure that you actually watch all of that so that he will explain in a number of hours all of his sources and so on. So, but we're going to use another one of his slides. This one is one of the ones that he has used now very recently, and you have there the name of the channel and all of that. So make sure if you are not up to speed with these latest uh, finds of his, that you do so at one point, sooner rather than later. And the conclusion was this: some of the manuscripts, as they have now been found, they're actually not going back nearly long enough close to Mohammed. They're actually very, very recent. So we decided to actually take this timeline and actually plot a few other things based on the searches that we've made and things like that. So let's see what happens if we look at one of the early sources that everybody really likes quite a lot. I'm a fan of this one, which is John of Damascus, his Fount of Knowledge, his Heresy of the Ishmaelites. So when we look at his account, we find a number of things. You can actually read the whole thing. We also have a video on the channel where it is actually read out with an AI voice, and everything is wonderful. So make sure that if you are interested about his account, you actually listen to that one. It's really good. Even I've listened to it quite a few times, despite of knowing his account almost by heart. Now, John of Damascus, he was around in the end of the 7th century and beginning of the 8th century in that general area, and he said many things. We are not going through the full argument. We have just actually picked a couple. One of note, which we have discussed quite recently and at length, is that he does not mention the Quran by name. He doesn't call it the Quran. He says a book. There was a book that this Muhammad claimed to have. And also, another account is that he says that these people speaking with him, these proto-Muslims, these Ishmaelites, they were saying to him that the revelation came to Muhammad in his sleep. So we don't have the name of the book mentioned. We don't have the night journey as we now know it, as we've been told. So if we plot all of that next to him, these are the main topics that we're going to look at. He does not mention the Quran by name. He does not mention the events at the cave of Hira or the night journey or the moon split or Jibril giving revelations to Muhammad. As an apologist, John of Damascus would certainly have spoken about those things, as well as how Muhammad died and all of those things. And he doesn't talk about any of that, even though if he would have. So I think that is a particularly important piece of information because as an apologist, he would have been making fun of things like he did about the Quran, saying that it came down in the sleep of Muhammad. So he pointed that out. If the whole night journey had been developed at that point, he would have said something about it, but he didn't. So we're there in the early 8th century, and John of Damascus does not mention any of those very, very important stories from the narrative. Kash, is there anything that you would like to comment our bestie John of Damascus?
Our best boy, John. Yeah, John of Damascus. He would have been very particular. He is very particular. He writes on heresies. He's writing 101 heresies. He's being very detailed in his account. So one thing of many, the lack of naming the textual tradition by a name like Quran, it suggests that he didn't know simply, because if he knew, he would have been particular. He's reporting back to the church. This is important information. If you keep it vague, maybe someone comes across the book and doesn't know it because you only reported it as a certain book. So it would be reasonable to me to suggest that therefore this knowledge simply either isn't available to him or it doesn't exist yet.
Right. Maybe the stories exist, but this guy is in Damascus, and the stories exist, in Basra or something like that. So he doesn't hear the stories, and therefore it's not recorded. That's why we look at different sources and say, okay, so John of Damascus didn't know about them, even though he certainly would have, because he was at the center of the Islamic Empire. He was actually in the capital city of the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus. So he should have known. But if he didn't, okay, maybe somebody else. So let's have a look at another source.
And
But
also,
first,
JC, he was in the court also. It's not just that he was in Damascus, he was in the court of the caliph. So this was a
yes,
very important man who engaged deeply, presumably, with the Ishmaelites who are in control of the court, obviously. So this information would have been certainly accessible to him.
yeah, and he worked actually for the caliphs, and he actually left Damascus on the same year that Abdul Malik actually died. So I find that a little bit sus. Okay, but I'll just
Interesting.
leave it there. Just a curious coincidence. Okay, so back to the timeline. Now we can remove him. I've tried to do that kind of move that J. Smith does. I'm actually not very good with it, but I'm trying my best. Now, the next source as well from that period, which is Leo III. Also, we've discussed this one on the channel, and we have some extracts of the conversation of letters that Leo III sent to Umar II between the year 717 and 723. That's when the book had been written. So first thing that we notice is he is telling to Umar II that, hey, we know that your book was actually created by these three guys, but also he does not call it Quran. So we are still at the right time as John of Damascus on the ballpark, and he does not use that name, that title for the book. Once again, he actually calls the Quran, Furqan, and he was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. He would have all of the information available. His letters are incredibly detailed. He writes a lot, yet a very important piece of information, which is the name of the book that they claim to be divine, he gets it wrong. So it looks like it was not coined at that point, as we've discussed in the past. Another thing is he talks about the Holy Spirit talking, commuting with Jesus, and then immediately after says, whereas your Muhammad did not come in the name of our Lord, but in his own name. Now, if during the time of Leo III there was the belief that an angel Gabriel, had appeared to Muhammad, he would be mentioning that. He would be talking about it and says, "What are you talking about?" More worryingly, the Quran keeps calling the Spirit the Holy Spirit. There, I think there were 4 verses, we've discussed this one before, called the Holy Spirit. If there was a belief that the Holy Spirit, as Jibril or the Christian belief, was being said to speak with Muhammad, Leo III would have spoken about it, but he didn't. So it's like he's very much implying that Muhammad was just a guy who said, "Hey, this book is divine, trust me." So when we look at what he did, just like, or the topics that he didn't discuss, just like with our friend John of Damascus, he does not mention the Quran by name. He doesn't talk about events in the cave of Hira, the night journey, the moon split, or Jibril as the Holy Spirit of, or anything of the sort, which of course means we can actually remove him from there. So far, we are nearly the year 750, and we don't have a single piece of information of these very, very important topics. We know that there is a Mahmad or Muhammad. We know that this empire has started to spread, but we don't really have much information. At that point, we didn't even have inscriptions that uses the word Islam. I think they appear in like the year 720 or something like that. Um, Kash, is there anything you would like to say about our good friend as well, Leo III?
Well, I'd definitely emphasize the point you were making about if there was any claim about the Holy Spirit being an angel, this would have been so blasphemous to the ears. Because just remember, the whole point is, I mean, the worst thing you can possibly do, the only unforgivable sin, is to blaspheme the Holy Spirit. So to suggest the Holy Spirit was actually Gabriel or something of the sort, this would have been this like the main point that all of these Christian polemicists would have been driving forth. And so its absence, just as one of the many points, of course, Cape of Hira, Night Journey, and so forth, it's just one of them, the Jabril story. But that most certainly, definitely wasn't a test of this point, or it would have been talked about.
Right. And that's now 2 out of 3, pretty much, before we look at other evidence as well. So I had removed him, and we're now going to look at one of the most important ones, which is the Apology of Al-Kindi. Oh, and I always forget, so now I remember, I'll just say it. Please make sure that you like this stream. That actually helps us a bunch. And subscribe if you are not subscribed. If you share, that would be very much appreciated, because that's the only way that we are getting any growth, which is by people sharing links. But thank you for being here. And let's carry on now with Al-Kindi. So this one is an interesting one because we don't really know who Al-Kindi is. I think I may have given the wrong dates on a previous video. So those ones are the ones where we think this person actually lived. Now, the Apology of Al-Kindi is incredibly detailed. Hopefully, we can AI it at one point, and you can actually listen to the whole account. But it is massive. It is pretty much a whole book. There is a Muslim sending a letter to Al-Kindi, who is a Christian, and he is replying back with a lot of information. And he explains how Islam began. Of course, he is writing 215 years after the Hijrah. So it's very, very late, but his account is very detailed. He actually says many things that ring true when we unpick the Quran. One of them is that he mentions this guy called Nestorius, also called Sergius, and sometimes they even call him Gabriel or the Faithful Spirit. In his account, he's talking about those things, and we discussed about this particular entry in this apology when we spoke about Jibril. So it looks like when we got to the time of Al-Kindi, the belief of the Holy Spirit being Angel Gabriel and appearing to Muhammad, that was not coined yet. It was starting to develop. And we see how it's possible that they got that confused. If there was this Nestorian monk whose name was Sergius, and then they call him Nestorius, and he's also being called Gabriel, and sometimes they call him the Faithful Spirit. You could see how 200 years later, people would start thinking that Gabriel is the angel, not the guy, and the Faithful Spirit is the Holy Spirit, not the guy, and things start to go down a very, very weird path. So he doesn't mention Gabriel being the spirit unless you see those as being Nestorius. So he doesn't mention anything of that. The other interesting thing about his account is that he's the first one that we have found that actually mentions the word Quran as it is. The previous ones, as we've seen, John of Damascus calls it a book, and Leo III calls it Furkan. So by the time that we get to the 800s, is when the name Quran seems to actually, we can actually attest for it outside of the Islamic sources. Also, if anyone watching has not actually watched our video on the actual Quran, the 4-hour live stream, the punchline of that live stream is that Quran was not even read that in the beginning. It actually took a long time for that term to become associated with their book. In the beginning, that was not it. It was actually something else. And if you haven't watched that stream, make sure that you do it at one point because it will be an eye opener. So, Quran at this point has become this holy book. Before that, it was, say, one of the spirits of God, one of the emanations of God. But at this point, which we are already very solidly into the Abbasids, and according to the narratives, they are creating the Sirah, they are creating the Tafsir, they are creating the Hadiths. So it looks like they have also created or edited the book sufficiently to have its own name for the book, which is Quran, which means at least we have one attestation. Al-Kindi doesn't talk about the Cave of Hira, the Night Journey, the Moon Split, or Jibril, and we're on the 830s. And when you read everything that he wrote, which is a really, really lengthy document, you have the feeling that he wrote everything that he knew. So if the Cave of Hira was a thing, he would have spoken about it. If the Night Journey was a thing, he would have spoken about it, and so on. And hopefully they didn't miss it, and it's actually there. So a few more
Wait,
things.
JC,
Now,
can you go back to the
yeah, yeah,
previous slide? I want to point out something
yeah,
interesting
yeah.
with the no, also one before, please. Yeah, so here, what I find very cool and interesting is so the picture being painted by Kindi in regards to names. So names like Gabriel, Faithful Spirit, it's interesting. And then we have this being associated as, like, let's say, titles or other names that are being told, according to Kindi's perspective, as names for this character called Bahira or Sergius or Nestorius. I guess the proper name would probably be hard to say exactly, actually. That said, it's this picture being painted by Kindi that there is this person known by these different names who is a flesh and blood human being who gave a book or gave this, textual tradition, theological tradition to this individual that Kindi identifies as being this Muhammad character. And the fact that then later the idea evolves, or let's say it becomes so, that the tradition is a Gabriel angel Gabriel, obviously, is also the Holy Spirit. Maybe the faithful spirit is an evolutionary step to getting to that point eventually. But it seems like you can track with the names according to Kindi's account, and this is pre-association with the spirit, as Kindi does not make that connection, which is why we also showed it still in X. But you can see how the names would then coalesce and become this idea in the future, but not quite yet.
Yeah, and when we plot all of these things on a timeline, we will see how we start to get almost a picture of when things were really happening at the different times of Abbasids and then the Ottomans. So before we actually plot this information on a timeline, let's actually look at, sorry, we've seen this one as well. So at least Quran is attested. Yay, we got one thing attested. Other few things so that we can plot all of this on a table. So on the timeline. So the cave of Hira as the place where the first revelation came. After asking AI quite a few times, because this is not a source that we have actually read, but I certainly am going to try to get it, is that it is around between 810 and 814 when someone actually mentions that. I will take this opportunity to say everything that now we've got through AI has been really hit and miss, even though we have actually checked and double checked, but it's been hit and miss. There are quite a few times that we got AI to say the attestation of this is found in John of Damascus. And he's like, no, it isn't. I know that thing by heart. And we have checked and double checked, and it's not there. Then we check again with AI and say, no, it's not there. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. So all of these sources, they seem to be very hit and miss. So if you happen to be history enthusiast and you really like this sort of research, if you find any errors on anything that we are saying today, like you find that the cave of Hira actually is not in that account and it happens to be in the 12th century, so please drop us a line, give us a comment so that we can actually update this. Likewise, if it happens in the other direction, if you find a Byzantine record from the 650s of somebody actually making this claim, then please let us know. So this is the best that we could do, but AI has been pretty much a pain. So take it with a pinch of salt. If you find the actual final answer on any of these events, please let us know because we want to get this timeline as correct as possible. So, but for now, we will go with all of these answers that we've been given through AI and testing and so on. The Cave of Hira, 810 to 814. Okay, so that's already 9th century. You would think that people from the Byzantine Empire they would already have been talking about this prophet in their Abrahamic faith from a different land receiving revelations in a cave. But we haven't found that. Then this one is interesting. The account of the Battle of Badr, or a brief mention of it, is found even in Al-Kindi, which is odd because the Battle of Badr never happened. But an interesting thing is that the Islamic traditions say that 1,000 angels were sent down to aid Muhammad and his forces. Al-Kindi doesn't talk about that. In fact, it looks like nobody talks about angels being sent to Muhammad to aid him in battle until about the 12th century. So again, if you know something, if you know otherwise, and you find other sources that confirms that it is before or after, please let us know. But the Battle of Badr, it seemed to be like an evolving story as well. One that we really like is the splitting of the moon, and it would be great if somebody actually can points us to the actual earliest source outside of the standard narrative about the moon split. If you think about it, the Quran keeps saying that Muhammad didn't have any miracles, and then there is in Surah 54, yes, one line that happens to be the biggest miracle of all, is splitting the moon, which in order to understand that, because that's not what the Quran says, you have to go to the Hadith, and the Hadith says, yes, he split the moon. Okay, that would be the miracle that everybody talks about. It's like asking a Jew, okay, so but what did Moses do? They would immediately say, yeah, he split the sea, like we all know that. With Christians, I would say, well, any number of miracles, but certainly the death and resurrection. But with Muhammad, this is the only miracle that, according to their sources, is actually in the book, unless you actually think that the Quran is a miracle itself, which in a way it is, but we're not getting into that. So the moon split is not really being shouted from the rooftops from every single Muslim, and is being discussed by Christian apologists saying, why are you guys saying that the moon split? It just didn't happen. So we haven't found a single record that talks about that from outside of the narrative. The only thing that we got is from AI saying, well, there are some discussions in the 16th century about stuff, and it doesn't even talk about the moon split. So we are at a complete loss, but it looks like the moon split might be a much, much, much later creation. In that note in there, it says, um, Indian historian Sridhara Menon from the 20th century dismisses related legends as anachronistic. Basically, they were created yesterday afternoon, and they said that they had been around for 1400 years. Another one is the name of the city of Yathrib, because it's kind of an odd one. So you have a city that everybody knows the name of as Yathrib, and it had been there for a really long time. And then certain events happen, and they rename this city from Yathrib to city. And it just sounds silly. Of course, they would say, no, 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 it was the Medina Nubi, so the city of the prophet. It's like, yes, but you have always just called it city. Why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense when you have a perfectly good name for a city. So when is the first time that someone outside of the standard Islamic narrative says there was this city called Yathrib, okay, now it's actually called Medina? So it looks like that is as well in the 9th century. If you know otherwise, let us know. Mecca also appearing very end, very close to the end of the 8th century, so as well during the Abbasids. So it looks like they were creating and renaming places in reality because those words appeared in the book and they had to justify the book. So it certainly looks that way. And I think this is probably the last one, is the Burak, the donkey, the magical donkey that Mohammed rode from Mecca to Jerusalem before he actually went up to the heavens. So this name Burak appears in other sources. There are legends and there are poems, including that. But the actual story of Mohammed flying on that, it looks as well like there aren't many sources until like the 12th or 13th century when this story starts to take flight. So, right, what happens if we put things into this timeline? Well, we have quite a few things like the word Quran would be attested there. You can always assume that either it was created before but nobody wrote it down, or the source is actually much later and then is redacted back. You can actually go both ways on that one. Makkah is not actually mentioned until we get to that point. The same happens with Medina, the renaming of Yathrib to Medina. We didn't actually discuss this one today. We've done it in other shows, but Masjid al-Haram and Masjid al-Aqsa, built in 697 and 709 respectively. So also much later, much after the time of Muhammad. The cave of Hira. So one of the sources, actually I can remember why I put it there. I thought it was something different. So as well in the 800s when it is mentioned. Did I actually see that? Can't remember. Maybe I got that one wrong. The Battle of Badr, including angels, because you would think that a battle shouldn't surprise anyone, but if 1,000 angels are sent down from the heavens to aid you, that really makes you a prophet. But it looks like that description doesn't appear until around the 12th century. And the moon split, just to actually pick a date, because we don't have one, could be 16th century. That one is probably wrong. I'm sure that there will be other accounts before, but we haven't found them. So if you can find them and let us know, that would be great. Burak, mentioned for the first time, associated with Mohammed right there. Oh, and you can probably see then from this image what we are like trying to do. If we find the attestations of different important moments and events and names and so on in the Islamic narrative, and we plot them on a map when those, on a timeline, when those were actually discussed outside of the Islamic sources, we can maybe gain an understanding as to how the stories of Islam actually evolved. We know that the hadiths are written much later, probably by the time that we get to Ottomans, that's when they are canonized. Before, there would have been plenty of stories because we get stories or pieces of stories here and there from Al-Kindi and John of Damascus and so on. So there would be some stories, but not the full thing, not the full sira and so on. If we get more of these points of information and we put them all on a timeline, maybe we actually get a clear understanding as to when things were fabricated. What do you think about this, Kash?
Yeah, it was like they had all these different stories, yeah, but the whole canonization idea is that all of these stories then get put together in a form that is internally coherent. It tells a cohesive narrative. That's when they all get put in a place where then you get this entire elaboration about the Hijaz, about Mecca to Medina, and so on and so forth. The actual creation of the entire cohesive narrative of all the stories being mapped together. So with this timeline, it's and also with the whole idea of like looking for sources outside of the Islamic sources, the point with that whole exercise is that these Islamic sources, they come so late, like Jay Smith always points out, and therefore, at best, they're back redacting what may be a true memory of real history in a sense, but at the end of the day, they're still back redacting their sources. So when we're looking at non-Islamic sources, all that it really means to say is contemporary sources. All that we're really saying with that is, okay, do we have a document that we can really date to this period of time where this belief appears to be attested, right? This source, for example, shows that the author believed Muslims to believe that there was a revelation through Gabriel and so on and so forth, right? So that's what we're looking for. We're saying, okay, if this was supposedly the belief in the way that the book was read from the beginning, because that's really what we're concerned with. Our primary concern is to understand what the text actually says. So part of that activity is also to see what beliefs there seem to be over time in regards to the book. That way we can sort of get an idea of how the ideas came to be, which then reflects on how the text was read at any given point in time. So when we're looking then at these sources, it seems that there were these, let's say, two major chunks just on a bird's eye view here, where you have this Abbasid era process that that happens, and then you have this Ottoman era process that happens, and both contribute to the eventual idea of the Hijazi Muhammad, although, not neither one nor the other was all sufficient, right? It was sort of like this one needed to happen in a sense, and then this one happened potentially, and regardless, we end up where we are today.
Yeah, and this is actually the last of the stuff that we actually put on this timeline. But we have another couple of things just to discuss, and then we can have a conversation about, well, either Raymond Ibrahim or Jay Smith, and what is going on and what is the difference between the two. But just before we actually get there, well, let's have a look. There is this thing has been bothering me a lot for a really long time. We cannot actually see very clearly what the stuff is in museums in Mecca, but I have actually gone through some websites. One of them is that one up there. And also you can see people who have been to these museums in Mecca and they have actually recorded the stuff. Now, I have been to lots of museums in my life, way too many. And you normally get the stuff going all the way to Paleolithic period. You have vases, you have the whole thing. But when it comes to Mecca, that is not what I have seen in any of the museums. For starters, everything is full of pictures. They just keep showing them pictures about the Kaaba in the 50s, the Kaaba in the 60s, the Kaaba in the 70s. It's like, why is this museum showing me so much like modern stuff? In fact, there is something in the museum in there which is 1983. I am older than something that is found in that museum. That is just crazy. But when you look at the dates, I've only added the dates from a guy who was actually there recording all of these things. I've copied the dates that he was showing on all of the stuff on display. So we had 19th century, 16th century, 15th century, 14th century, 19th century, everything very, very late. And then there are a couple of interesting things. One of them is, well, this big picture that you have there, everybody's very excited about it, which is the stairs that they used to use to actually go up to the Kaaba. Yeah, that's from the 19th century. And they're very excited about it. It makes me think, have these people ever been to an actual museum where you have historical stuff? It's absolutely insane. Then they have this thing, a ruined portion of a wooden pillar of the Holy Kaaba from 685. So it is an actual piece of wood. That's actually, if you go and you see it, it's a round piece of wood, and they say this actually comes from the Kaaba. We will discuss that one just in a minute. And they have a Quran in there, and the notes say it is an Uthmanic mushaf, which it isn't, and we know that. So if you go and you just check a little bit and says, hey, which one is this Uthmanic mushaf they have in display over there? You are going to see, even AI is going to tell you, no, 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 they don't have an Uthmanic mushaf. They probably mean that it is a mushaf that was copied from what before it was the Uthmanic one, but it's not the Uthmanic one. So even in the museum, they have something like this to be misleading because they need to have something going back to the 7th century. And there is, what do they have that goes back to the 7th century? Well, one column, which you cannot carbon date. You have a piece of wood, which you can carbon date, and it would be very interesting to see if if it's been carbon dated. That would be interesting to know. They have this Uthmanic Mushaf, which is not from the 7th century. And another thing that they have, I think it's in a different place, is in the Station of Abraham, is the footprints of Abraham, which also always bothered me because they're just two pieces of stone. And they have been there apparently, well, according to the standard Islamic narrative, since 2000 BC. But no one ever talked about them. There has been no pilgrims going in there and recording what they have done, and even any comments about these footprints of Ibrahim are incredibly scarce. So the one that we actually found, according to AI, is around the 12th century, when somebody from outside of the standard Islamic narrative says that these things existed. So at the moment, they look like two pieces of stone, which you cannot do anything with them. Anybody would have actually would have stepped in them. And when you look at the cast around it, it's actually quite modern because it has harakat, it has diacritical marks, and it's certainly not done from before the time of Islam. So I would have to explain how they had for 2,700 years two pieces of stone, and knowing that Abraham stood there. This actually sounds like they had to justify something. They had to create relics, and they just pointed at a particular pieces of stone on the ground and said, "Yeah, Abraham stood there because if he built the Kaaba, he must have stood there. So cut them out, and now we have a relic." It certainly feels in that way. So now we can have a conversation. What do you think, Kash?
I think the last thing you were just talking about with the footprints, it gives me the energy of like a gift shop after you exit a museum. It doesn't feel real, right? So, yeah, essentially we have this issue, which is someone was there, attested by sources like Sebios, where we have this MHMT or MHMD initial understanding of the name, and then this individual was, by Sebios's account, preaching the coming of Messiah, which is interesting because if it is meant to be MHMD, MHMD is a messianic title, so why would MHMD preach the coming of MHMD? Doesn't make much sense. So that's why I lean towards the MHMT being um, the initial name essentially, and which would explain by why it lasted so long that in Western sources he was referred to as Mahomet for basically forever, even up to Crusade times and so on, deep into them and so forth, right? So there is this historical individual, but then the question becomes who is this MHMD who occurs in the text itself? Because we have these four instances, so they have to be explained somehow. So if we do have this supposed tradition of this individual of the 7th century, which somewhat it's close, the account is very close. So therefore, what we're told is that these are the same people. This is the same person. This MHMT sort of political, not political figure necessarily, because he was also preaching coming of Messiah and so forth. He was a teacher who taught the law to the Saracens, to the Ishmaelites. And this individual then is firmly attested in history. The question is whether this individual is this Hijazi guy. And the sources are also pointed out about how these MHMDs are attested in upward, like in northern Syria, here and there, right? So the geography is wrong, the time is wrong, and so forth. So there is this MHMD floating around as a title. That's another aspect. But foundationally, the question is this MHMT of this historical period the MHMD in the Quran? And I would put forward that they're actually totally unrelated. The only thing that they share in common is a similar orthography, and therefore it gives room for the eventual connection in time, right? As in, I would place it probably around the time of the Quran attestation. So this would be around the time probably of, I guess the ninth century probably. But regardless, this association between the historical person and this MHMD of the text, that seems to come late. What do you think, Joseph?
What I think is that everything seems to, well, let's actually think about J. Smith's thesis. He puts the book, the man, and the place, and they are not there in the 7th century in the Hijaz and all of that. Okay, fine. So if that is correct, then the evidence that is actually found should be confirming that to a degree. And that's actually what we find. All of the stuff that we have discussed today is not the deal breakers. It's not that you see, this is exactly what J. Smith is saying, and this gives more validity. It's like, no, no, no. What we are actually trying to do is like, okay, if he's right, then there will be stories appearing later. We would actually see them being mentioned later, even though there are things that should be really, really important in the traditions, and they should have been discussed probably from the 8th century. But if you don't have them, it's like, okay, does it look like what J. Smith is saying is right? Well, we look at the stories and they don't seem to be there. Nobody's talking about these incredibly important stories. Imagine people not talking about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus for 600 years. What would you think about the story? You would think there is a problem and they have made it up. So, why are they not talking about the moon split? And with Mohammed, so the same, like you are saying, we have that name is attested, or that title, everywhere in the north, in the south, before the time of Mohammed, after the time of Mohammed, is everywhere. Okay, but J. Smith says, is these accounts of a Muhammad or a Mahmad or a Mahmad, are they there? Are they in the right place? And when the answer is no, it doesn't fit the narrative. It's like, fine, you're talking about somebody else. So you cannot point at that and says this inscription in Syria confirms that the Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative existed. It's like, no, that inscription confirms that there was one guy in Syria who was a warlord who took the title Mahmad or Mahmad. It's not the same guy. So I think we're seeing all of these things even when we look at the speculative information or some things like this, like the stories. We certainly see an evolution, and we've seen that with Mecca increasing the number of pillars from 1 to 3 in our lifetime, and the book being all of a sudden eternal. But that happened in 1985 and being only one Quran. Before, nobody talked about being one Quran because there were plenty of them. But we've seen that they have actually forced a narrative even during our lifetimes. So it looks like that is what was happening for 1400 years. Well, more like 1200, but we normally say 1400, right?
Yeah. So the question, okay, so the thing is this, right? It's not unnormal, like abnormal to get historical accounts that come later than the person in history. That's fine, right? The thing is, when we get these late accounts that are talking about this person, and it appears like, the accounts are coming from stories about Abdul Malik, and some stories are coming from Jesus himself. It's like there's this mess going on. And when it comes to a question of, okay, these sources exist claiming certain things. They make claims about in the Hijaz, there was a guy, he married a girl, they lived happily ever after, right? It tells the story that we have going on. Okay, cool. So what's going on with this? What is it pointing to? Is this claim actually something in history that happened? And well, the first issue, of course, is they're pointing to a location where nothing was happening. So there was no story about Mecca going to Medina like we just saw in the chat, right? From Zakar, he pointed that out. So yes, you can make claims about a historical person. Yes, there can be a person that vaguely is part of the mixture of traditions. But if you're making claims so late about a person, a time frame where it does appear that the evidence on the Quranic side. So from our perspective, we're coming at it from the view of going through the Quran itself and finding that these stories about the supposed Hijazi man are not actually related to this Quranic material at all. So the tradition is totally foreign to the text. And therefore, when we're talking about this person of tradition who lived at a place which we can't attest, which wrote this textual tradition supposedly from a revelation which we can attest to be dubious, given the fact that the Quran word only exists through the introduction of the Hamza, and therefore talk in the text of emanations is suddenly recast in the middle of the 9th century into talk of a self-proclaimed third revelation. So all of these things are pointing to the fact that this tradition of a Muhammad is, yeah, most likely a collection of many, many different individuals, like the collective memories about Umar, collective memories about Abdul Malik, collective memories about this Mahmet of the original preacher who was preaching the coming of Messiah in the early 7th century, that era, right? That these traditions, these memories then eventually get put into a form of textual material, but they come too far late, and they're not talking about a real person. They're placing all of these memories onto an individual to map the whole idea of the book, the man, the place. Because like J. Smith always focuses on these are necessary to establish a third branch, right? Because before this, presumably, you would have people who were they would essentially be sects of Christianity, right? But a third revelation establishes with a third prophet, you know, a third city which is holy now, right? Jerusalem was the city. All of a sudden, now we have a whole new city, right? So you create these things later and then read them back into the text. So therefore, all of these accounts are potentially some of them totally fabricated, presumably, but many of them probably true and pointing to something real that happened. However, it's just not, the details aren't correct. So if you say something, so and so did something, but it was someone else who did that, is that a real historical account? Well, it's alluding to a real memory. There's something that they're real that really happened, but because the referent is wrong, the whole thing is made up anyway. So it isn't a real historical account anyway. So you would drop that. So that's how I would see it, JC.
Yeah. So Mecca and Medina. So those cities, we don't want to actually talk a lot about those because we're still working on that. Our feeling so far is Mecca is not talking about Mecca. It's not even talking about a city. And if you actually read the translation from Murad, you will think that Mecca actually stands out like a sore thumb. Also, it only appears once in the Quran. Becca is Becca, Makkah is Makkah, but it is not the name of a city. The problem with unpicking that one is that it is only once that it appears in the whole book. So if it appeared in more places, we would actually use the context and try to decipher it in that manner. But Makkah appears only once. And now, what about Yathrib? Yathrib appears once, but Murad doesn't write Yathrib in his translation. He actually writes a word because it actually Yathrib actually means something. I forgot what it is. And then in the Quran, you have all of these accounts of the city, the city, the city, the city. And then you get Yathrib renamed the city of the prophet. And it's like, no, hang on a minute. Now we know plenty about this. We know that the Masjid al-Haram was built in the year 697. So that means the book is floating around. People recognize something called the Masjid al-Haram, and then it gets built into the real world. The same with the Masjid al-Aqsa. It's in the book, and then in the year 709 is actually built. Okay, what about Makkah? Well, the same. Makkah appears once in the book. Why do we now have a city that is Makkah and is the center of everything? Because it appears once in the book. If we look at the map of Ptolemy, there are lots of different cities in there, and Makkah doesn't appear. Well, there's a very good chance that Makkah, the original one, wasn't there. It just was a very small settlement of like 10 people, and it had a different name. But when they are starting to build things in the real world, because the name appears in the book, then is when Mecca really appears. Now, do we have any attestations of Mecca before Islam? No, we actually have them after. Medina, the same. Now that we understand the book better and we know it was very Trinitarian and all sorts of things, the city must be Jerusalem. That is the one thing that would make sense. It is possible that it was a different city and it was very important for those people, let's say perhaps Petra or something like that. But on balance of probability, when the Quran talks about the city, must be Jerusalem. Is the city that everybody would understand. All of these stories are very, very Judeo Christian. It is the city that you would not need to name ever. So, yes, I think that Mecca and Medina, they were created in the real world because they had to justify the book, just like we have with the Masjid al-Haram, the Masjid al-Aqsa, and even the story of Muhammad. When we go to Mecca, we have all of these other places that appear in the traditions, like Safa and Marwa. Those things are just stones. They just had to create something and say, you see, our religion is true. They they were just compelled to do that. Now, when we then zero in on these two individuals, first I would say I actually admire both of them. They do an amazing job. They have two very different jobs. So I'm going to be as diplomatic as I possibly can because I do admire both of them, and hopefully at one point they will pick up our calls and we will manage to speak with them. I don't think that any of them is wrong. I think they are just talking about something very different. Now, Raymond Ibrahim, he is a historian. Historians don't generally go, say, like Indiana Jones with a shovel and starts digging and finding things. A historian reads historical accounts. That's what they do. And they understand that historical accounts, you can never be 100% certain. In fact, every single account that we have from the past has a part of history and a part of fiction. And very often you cannot tell what part is true and what part is fiction. But when you have lots of accounts, you start to get a picture. For example, there is an account during the Crusades that the Crusaders actually found a dragon on their way to Jerusalem. And I think that one is not true. So, these sort of things happen in historical accounts. The person writing the document originally would have his bias. Also, he would be in one city seeing things with his own eyes in a very small place, and then he would listen to stories from travelers and so on. So the accounts are never good, never perfect. We don't have a time travel machine and we can go there and confirm it. So what historians do is they get lots of different stories. And when you have a lot of evidence about something, then you know that the real history is somewhere somewhat in the ballpark of those stories. Not 100% correct, but correct enough. And the way that it works, so like that, Raymond Ibrahim, he's doing what historians do. The book needs to come from someplace, and the stories about Muhammad needs to come from someplace, and Islam happened to be a thing. So therefore, we need to find where it came from. And then he goes to the sources, and there is a lot of information about it. So he takes that and says, well, a lot of it is probably fabricated. Like this guy didn't receive a book from the heavens, but probably he walked around and told the stories, and he said to people, I'm a prophet, believe me or I kill you. And and things go in that way. So he would take most of those stories and then say they have a lot of truth in them. J. Smith is not like that. He looks at those stories and he's the guy with the shovel and says, no, hang on a minute. I'm not taking all of that as being mostly correct. I'm actually looking at what the evidence on the ground actually says. And if the evidence is confirming those accounts, they are then fine. But if the information that is being found is contradicting that, then we have this very curious event where it looks like the history of Islam was not written by people in good faith, as most of history is written by people just describing what is happening in front of them. All of the evidence found seems to indicate that it was created not in good faith, but in order to create something, and that is the Islam that we now have. So they are doing two different things, even though this little feud that they have as to whether Muhammad was a real person or not. Raymond Ibrahim, I don't think that he really cares about the specifics as to exactly what he said and whether he believed that he was a prophet or not. He takes it as a historian. Okay, yeah, there was something over there and the Hijaz, Mecca, and a guy that got very lucky conquering land, and that's that. So, okay, so he existed. What J. Smith is doing is, no, hang on a minute. It couldn't even be in that region. These stories are not written in good faith. Things have changed. These are my words, not his words. But they have actually created a whole different narrative. It's not mostly correct. It is almost entirely incorrect. And the stories that we get, they are fabrications in order to justify the rule of the caliphs and whatever it was. That's the difference. I think they are talking about two very different topics, even though it feels like they're talking about the same one. Did Muhammad exist? Did he not exist? It's like I don't think that Raymond Ibrahim actually cares that much about that. He looks at the sources, and that's what the sources say. J. Smith is saying those sources are false. I think that's the difference. Now, as a different example, imagine in history that you find a source and says that there is a particular Roman general who went to Scandinavia and then conquered lots of lands, and you only have that one source of information. So, did it happen or not? Well, as a historian, you would conclude that probably not. But hey ho. But then what happens if people have a dig somewhere in Scandinavia and they find remains. They find a Roman fortress, they found inscriptions, they find the name of that general. Now, that piece of document now is more important because it said something, and now we have extra information. Maybe you find coins, maybe you find accounts from the locals that they wrote something down about being invaded by the Romans. So history is not about you take one source and that's the full picture. It's the opposite. You get all of the information available and you form like that vague picture. As it happens with Islam, all of those sources, they happen to come from the standard Islamic narrative. It happens to come exclusively from the Islamic sources, and they happen to be very late. That's sort of the problem. Under normal circumstances, you would take all of those sources, and that gives you a very clear idea of what happened. The problem is that you would expect to find similar sources from the Byzantines, probably from the Persians, and from lots of other people in the vicinity, confirming all of these Islamic stories, except that we don't have them. In fact, the stuff that we find indicates that there was one guy, a military leader, who went around and people started following him. But he's not the guy described in the standard Islamic narrative. He's way too different. He was not in that region. He did not think that he was a prophet. He did not get a book and said it comes from the heavens, but quite the opposite. And if you read the account of Al-Kindi, you will understand very well what I have just said, because all of the information that we get is not talking about the Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative. So hopefully that explains like where I stand in relation to who is right. And I would say they are not talking about the same thing. They follow very different lines of approach, very different lines of inquiry, and their research doesn't even really cross over. Raymond Ibrahim takes the sources and then he keeps reading more sources, and Jay Smith is the one with a shovel.
Yeah, yeah, I would frame it like this. It's interesting because what's missing here to bridge the both of their positions is what Jay Smith is looking for. It's that we have these all these these sources, and as a historian you look at the sources, and the picture that's being painted, Raymond Ibrahim can very easily acknowledge that most of them are probably exaggerated or even made up entirely. However, from his perspective, he still has to, as a historian, explain the phenomena of the rise of Islam. And that's what everyone has to wrestle with. And when it comes to explaining this period of history, it's that how did that come to be, though? And when you have this sort of position where everything is feelingly obscure, sources come very late, knowledge of the actual time frame from like contemporary sources are lackluster. Um, you have to still explain it, and therefore, despite the fact that I presume, basically from Raymond Ibrahim's perspective, that despite the fact that the sources are quite untrustworthy, unreliable, the overall picture of there being an individual, a Muhammad of time and space, potentially in the Hajjaz and so forth, it still remains as the most compelling explanation because there is no other fully elaborated explanation to compete against that standard interpretation and that history. And I think what Jay Smith is trying to get at and what we are trying to get at is yes, okay, fair enough. There is this fully elaborated history, and yeah, we can both agree that a lot of it is potentially made up and so forth. And the reason why you are compelled to still say that this person existed is that there is this whole this whole history that's presented, and the issue is that that doesn't line up with what the Quran is actually saying. And this is where we come into the whole question: is that we're looking at it from the perspective of what the Quran is saying, and then looking at, okay, but does that match with the traditions? So therefore, the traditions, although we of course, know that the sources come late, it's from both angles. They come late, and also we can't find them attested in the spirit of the text itself. So therefore, what we're calling for, and I think Jay Smith would also be calling for, is yes, right? We have this issue with a difficulty presenting an alternative history. That's what we're trying to find. That's the work we're trying to do. We're trying to uncover what that alternate history that was then covered up, what that history really was. And that history should align with what the text of the Quran is actually saying. So that requires us to actually, fully figure it out, right? But it feels like that's kind of the last piece that's missing. Is yes, we have this tension between, okay, yeah, the sources are late. Yes, the sources are fantastical. Yes, they're trying to make reports about how, an emperor of Byzantium in his private correspondence was talking about Islam and this and that. Like, yes, like they're also dubious, right? But as it stands right now, there is no real alternative explanation. And then we're saying, okay, then let's find it. Let's find that alternative explanation that makes sense of all the sources, makes sense of all these unique phenomena like we catch about the whole Quran only really becoming Quran in the 9th century, and all these other aspects. We have to find a real cohesive narrative that explains all of the different aspects. Why are there Ethiopic words in the text? Why is the orthography the way it is? What happened in this exact the early 600s, right, up to 620? What exactly was happening there? All of these things have to line up and form a coherent image, and that's what we're trying to look for, instead of simply stopping and saying, okay, the sources are all dubious, I'm gonna wipe my hands and be happy to say, as a Christian, Muhammad was a historical person, but he was a false preacher, he was an antichrist. Happy days. I don't have to like look into it further. We're saying no. Let's look into it further, right? Don't even give the credence to quote unquote Islam that there was a book, that there was a man, that there was a place, right? In this traditional idea of a third revelation through this angel Gabriel who happens to be the Holy Spirit and yada 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 yada. Like all these other things that get tacked on later, right? So we're saying that the sources suggest that this is not what happened. Basically that. So something did happen in history because things happen, but it wasn't this because it doesn't map with everything we're seeing. So therefore, we'll look for what that alternate history is, and hopefully, then if we figure that out, we could then provide that to everyone, but also Raymond Ibrahim to potentially sway his opinion.
Yeah. And so just continuing with what you said, there are lots of people there who are looking at the inscriptions. They're looking at coins. They're looking at all of those different things. And Kash and I were actually saying, okay, let's actually look at the Quran because it seems to be very under researched. Everybody who has actually been looking at the Quran has been following a different process. For example, Gunther Lulling focused on the dark passages of the Quran, the ones that they actually nobody knows the meaning of. Christoph Luxemburg looked back at Tabari and all of the different tafsir and interpretations of the Quran from previous scholars. And when there were words that they didn't agree on, then he actually digs into those. Like that is one um, of his lines of approach. Gabriel Sauma, he just goes and tries to to just translate the whole thing, just read the whole thing in Syriac, and good luck. It's really big. And what Kash and I are doing is, okay, why don't we look at the things that make no sense? Because if we see a verse that says you were created from a liquid that emanates from between the backbone and the ribs, we know there is a problem because these people were sophisticated people. They were in contact with so many other empires, including the Abyssinians, the Persians, the Byzantines, previously the Romans, the Greeks, the Chinese, everyone. They were from the lands of Iraq, the Lahmeds. These people knew how babies were made. So if we see that in the Quran, that makes no sense, is what makes us think, hang on a minute. Is this that they really believe that? That's one option. Another one, they had a rasam they couldn't understand, so they ended up adding dots in a way that they just made up some words, even if it made no sense. Or number three, they knew exactly what it said, but they didn't want you to know what it was written. So they actually played with that. And so far, Kash, tell me what you think. It looks like that is what we are finding now more and more often, things that they didn't want the audience to read.
There's definitely a tendency. So there's the overall pattern, which is just the case that if you have a verse that you need to re-render, because that word appears in other instances of the text, right? You're quite restricted in the sense, not super restricted because they still get away with saying basically this word kind of means this all the time, and then in this context there's an exception somehow, right? But generally speaking, you have to stay restricted to the way that the words are all used in context. But there is a particular emphasis when you have instances where there's, for example, the talk of us being created potentially in accordance with the last or two streams ago or last stream about how mankind is created from that which flows from between the fat being the off part of the offering in the Old Testament that God actually consumes himself, and the cross. And that would then evoke the image of the Lord on the cross and his blood flowing from him, and therefore being this metaphysical statement about us being created from Christ, which is very much a New Testament belief. So, like with these instances, I forgot what I was saying. What was I getting at here?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Okay. Well,
I'll jump in. I'll jump
yeah.
to the rescue. So, for example, so with this work that we are doing, which is exclusively about the Quran, because it seems to be like very important. If we can read the Quran, then we will know better who actually wrote it. We have spoken in previous shows that we have at least some feelings about words like Sabians and even the Judaizers and so on. Like maybe those words are actually not there, and they have just basically twisted the text by adding diacritics and creating the meanings of words pretty much at that point because they needed to do that. So there is all of those things. But if we can read the book better, maybe we will know, we will be able to help the community pinpoint the place where it all began because we know it's north. Fine, fair enough. But why the other influences? So, this is actually what we're trying to do. And as an example of this, I'd say as well so, Dan Gibson, the guy that came up with the whole Petra thesis, I absolutely admire Dan Gibson. Don't want to say a single word bad against him because I absolutely love the work that he's done, and he's the true, say, archaeologist. He's the one that actually goes to the places, looks at the places, he puts his finger into every single, ruin and see what happens. So a lot of the stuff in his thesis is right, and there are things that they are actually wrong. So as all of the theses out there from Patricia Crone and from everybody else, it's almost like everybody's trying to get to the answer. They come up with one full thesis, and some things are right, some things are wrong, but it's getting the community in one direction. So one of his, for example, expectations of why it is Petra is because between the name of Petra and Mecca is actually very similar, and also that Mecca and Becca, they are pretty much spelled in the same way. So you just make a little error with the quill, and there you have it. Now you have Mecca instead of having Becca or having Petra. And he's like, yeah, that's actually quite a reasonable thing. And if you don't know the answer, you come up with anything that actually fits. And at one point or another, we will get there. What I'm thinking, for example, about Mecca is that there is not a name of the city in there at all. It's actually talking about something completely different. And maybe we're right, maybe we're wrong. Hopefully, we will get to the bottom of it. But by looking at the Quran and looking at the words that are there, the things that they have basically changed by adding, particularly the Hamzas. We all know about the diacritical marks, but the Hamzas is a big thing. Kash and I, now that every time that we see a Hamza, we know that they have just hidden the root. Now it's a different word altogether. So we take the Hamza out and we look at it. And hopefully, by doing that, we will find something specific in the book, which so far we haven't. Something like a name of an actual city somewhere in near Jerusalem, and say, hey, hang on a minute, this city is hidden here in the text. So far, we are not finding names. We didn't find Heraclius or something like that. We didn't find locations. It seems like the text was really, really vague to begin with, but it went from being very vague to then having a different meaning when they started reciting it in this bizarre manner. And then they went through an incredible effort to justify that that book was divine. And in order to do that, they create the whole thing in the real world. They create the stories, they create the seerah, the hadiths, they create the places in the real world, like the Masjid al-Haram, the Masjid al-Aqsa, Mecca, um, Medina, all of those things to justify the book. So from where Kash and I are standing, it looks like digging into the original meaning of the book is almost like the weakest link because we all have it. It pretty much goes back to the 7th century, the Rasam at the very least, and we are finding more and more things. And hence why we started as well this channel and telling these two people, showing it out there, because the more eyes we have on the Quran, the better. And we have lots of comments from people which are incredibly intelligent, incredibly insightful, saying, hey, what about this verse? How do you unpack that verse? And very often it's like, yeah, we didn't get there yet. It's 6,000 verses, but that's interesting. We are going to look into it. So we're in this mission to find answers. And seeing as everybody out there seems to be very preoccupied either looking at the hadiths or inscriptions or these sort of things, and reading the accounts of contemporary people, most of which they are obviously copies, as it always happens in history, we are just saying, okay, let's let all of those people do that. Let's try to read the Quran. Let's see how much we can unpack, and let's put out there for the community to actually help us out. We are all doing the same work, and hopefully we will find more and more things that will help join everything together with the historians, with the archaeologists, and with everybody else. Or at least that's the hope. And so far, we're actually getting people to comment, and it looks like people are really realizing every day more and more that the book was not even written in Arabic, not in full, not the way that we've been told, and they have noticed things that are silly, and then they're telling us, "Hey, this verse is silly. Look at that," which is what one of the methods that we use in order to identify potential problems. So keep them coming. If you're watching this, keep them coming. If you notice something in the Quran that makes no sense, that has always bugged you, if you figure it out, let us know. You come on the show and you show us. And if you haven't figured it out, but you want us to look into it, give us a comment, and we will see if we can figure it out for you, for us, and for everybody else. Right, Kash?
Yeah, so instead of having to worry about, having debates about hadith traditions or Muhammad this, or even necessarily even talking about the historicity of this figure, right? What you could actually do, which is kind of what we're trying to get at, is you could provide the real reading of the Quran in the sense that, like, because everyone basically assumes this is the problem. Everyone assumes, like, of course Muslims know how to read their holy book, right? Of course, right? But what if that wasn't the case? And that's the issue. That's the crux of the issue here. So therefore, if we go to the text and we try and really, really figure this text out, then what we could do is even present that and say, okay, the whole thing about Muhammad, this, that, this particular theology of this and that, like all of that comes later, and it's smokes and mirrors. If you can present what the text originally said, it's powerful, right? It brings it back to light what it was originally about, and therefore all of these other things, which then it gets revealed how they are in contradiction to what the Quran really says. It then becomes very clear. So that's another angle of approach, I suppose, right? You can come at this from the perspective of, let's say, the morality of Muhammad in the traditions, or the historicity of the character of Muhammad, or so and so. But this is another angle where we go at it in the perspective of, okay, what if we can actually show what the text itself says? So hopefully that is then what the end goal of all of this is, and it would put a lot of this to rest, I would say.
Yes, I think is everybody's feeling like quite curious, and it is a very exciting times to see something as big as that, as the belief of 1.8 billion people around the world, that the whole thing has been fabricated by very, very horrible people. That is actually, if you believe J. Smith and not Raymond Ibrahim. And actually, just to bring that uh, back again on topic, is so who is right? From where I'm standing, both Raymond Ibrahim and J. Smith, they are both right. They are not talking about the same topic. Raymond Ibrahim is looking at sources, reading them as a historian does, and J. Smith is the guy with the shovel. So I will just actually leave it there because they are not having the discussion as if you were having a conversation with a Muslim saying, but Muhammad didn't exist and they're going to try and prove it. Raymond Ibrahim just says, hey, there is plenty of sources. So that's that.
Yeah, exactly. Cool.
Okay, so I think that has been a nice chat. We have spoken pretty much first, yes, showing this timeline where we showed a few of the stories that we would expect to find very early on with Christian apologists like John of Damascus and so on, talking with Muslims about, like the night journey and the moon split and all of those things. But those things seem to actually appear much later. That is not a deal breaker. The work that Jay Smith and his team are doing is a deal breaker. But the things that we are noticing, they actually confirm to a degree, or they're compatible with what he's saying. Those stories, they don't seem to be talked about early, and certainly they should have. So I think probably after that, now we've discussed a lot about these guys and what we're doing, what we're trying to do, and what we think that the Quran may actually have lots of answers that will help everybody, including the historians, the archaeologists, and I still hope that Raymond Ibrahim at one point will actually go to the J. Smith's camp and say, actually, now I'm on the camp of Muhammad didn't exist. Everything was a fabrication. But that's just me. We will see what happens. And
Yeah, and
anything
just
else?
to,
Yes, should we
last
start
thing, just
really?
to
Yeah, yeah.
speak on what Zakar wrote about how it's just sort of a matter of time. Well, that's my adding into it, right? But it's talking about this approach, right? It's not been done before because again, we assume, of course, the top scholars, these almost unapproachable legends of Islamic history. Of course, they understood the Quran. So if you want to understand the Quran, you just go to the tafsir writers and so on and so forth, right? But now that we have this approach and we understand that, wait, there is actually something here. People like Goethe Lulling and Luxemburg, they evidence that. Like, there is a justification for pursuing this line of inquiry. And therefore, it's, I would say, just a matter of time now. And I would emphasize the use of these computational tools like large language models to enable the actual parsing of sources, the actual access to Semitic linguistics, even just as like a layman, just to sort of use it as a tool to find out the meaning of roots and so forth, right? It really is just a matter of time. It's just going to take time. People are going to put forward interpretations of verses. They're going to be wrong. That'll just be part of the process. That's totally fine. But eventually, we're just going to get there. Hopefully sooner than later, though. So I'll leave it with that.
Yeah, and I think now that there are more and more people looking into this problem, I think it will happen in our lifetimes and hopefully in the coming years as opposed to in future decades. So I think that has been a nice conversation for today, speaking about this now that these two gentlemen, extraordinary gentlemen, are having this little feud, and I look forward to seeing what happens in their next conversations. Hopefully, they will have a debate or something like that. And from us, we will be back on Thursday. Maybe we will talk about other sources used in the Quran, provided by a friend who might or might not actually make it on that day. But maybe we will actually talk on Thursday about other sources that we always ignore. There are a number of sources that we all know, like the pseudo gospel, like the infancy gospel, and things like that, but not much. And it seems like there are lots of other stories that they come from other sources. And in order to understand what was happening on the ground and how the Quran came to be, we need to understand what the influencers were to the book. So hopefully that will be on Thursday. I find it a fascinating topic because after studying Islam for quite a long time, I was not aware of other sources used in the Quran, stories that can be found almost in parallel, and also some stories that answer questions from the Quran, where you have a story that is half told in the Quran and it doesn't make any sense. And when you find the original source, you get the story. And suddenly the story makes sense. So that will be on Thursday, hopefully, unless we actually come up with something else, depending on availability. But otherwise, that will be Thursday, and it will be a very, very interesting live stream. So we hope to actually see you all there. And Kash, any last words before we switch off?
No, thank you all for listening and also engaging in the chat. That's been really awesome. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you all on Thursday.
Great. Great. So thank you all for watching. God bless you all. See you next time. Bye bye.
There is only one Quran, right? Every Quran in the world is the same. That's what you've been told. You have been told a lie!
26 of the Quran.
26 different Quran!
There are 0 Dawa guys apparently left on the planet who are willing to defend Muhammad in a debate.
Everybody can go and read it. This is a book full of mistakes in Arabic, in the grammar, in the spelling, in the pronunciation.
Whoever wrote the Quran made an error because they didn't quite understand what was written in the 7th century in the Torah and the Injil.
As promised, I will give you more than 20 reasons why I left Islam in this video.
We know that stories about Muhammad were made up on an industrial scale.
What in the world is this Injil?